Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for what we hope will be a really informative conversation with one of the more important writers on a subject that is on the tip of so many folks' tongues. And that really is the intersection between land use policy, zoning, and discriminatory practices that have hampered our region and our country for decades. I'm Ezra Hammer, Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs for the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Portland, and I'm really excited to welcome you to today's discussion. The Home Builders Association is a member-based organization made up of builders, remodelers, developers, and associated industries that work in the residential construction industry. We are deeply committed to advancing housing affordability and access to those throughout the greater Portland region. I want to thank Northwest Natural for being our presenting sponsor today, and 1000 Friends of Oregon, Latino Network, and The Oregonian as event partners. And it's my pleasure to introduce Nicole Johnson with 1000 Friends of Oregon. Nicole?
Thank you, Ezra. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Johnson. I am the Community Engagement Manager with 1000 Friends of Oregon. And 1000 Friends of Oregon is a land use advocacy organization, and our mission is to work with Oregonians to enhance quality of life by building livable urban and rural communities, protecting family farms and forests, and conserving natural areas. And we are just really excited to sponsor this event and participate in Portland Housing Month. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. It's also my pleasure to introduce David Mateo with Latino Network. David?
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Ezra. I'm so happy to be here. I am honored to be a part of this. It's wonderful to have an opportunity to speak on housing issues in Portland, something that we care deeply about at Latino Network through our advocacy and our assistance programs. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you.
And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Kim Heiting with Northwest Natural. Kim?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this important discussion. And Northwest Natural wants to thank the home builders of Portland. We're honored to sponsor today's event. We join the home builders in a belief that safe, affordable housing should be accessible to everyone. As a company, Northwest Natural's roots go back to 1859, actually the same year Oregon became a state. And I would say, you know, we're proud that we grew up here. We serve 2.5 million people today through 140 communities in the Pacific Northwest. We're certainly proud of our employees and our legacy of giving back to the communities through philanthropy and volunteerism. But we're also really proud that more than two decades ago, we began an intentional journey to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion with our employees, our suppliers, and in our communities. But we acknowledge that our business took root and grew in a state that was founded on laws that explicitly excluded people of color, and in a country with deeply institutionalized racism. And we know and understanding these roots is really the first step in making change. And important conversations like the one we're about to have is really essential in moving us all forward in the right direction. So I have the great pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Richard Rothstein. Richard has asked me not to go on and on about his credentials, so I will honor that, but I can tell you they are very impressive, ranging from a senior fellow at the Berkeley School of Law's Haas Institute to a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, among many other accomplishments. But most importantly for today's discussion, he is the author of The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And that fine book is available at Powell's and many of other great booksellers, so please check it out. Without further ado, my great pleasure to introduce Richard.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation today. I want to begin, if I may, by reminding you that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools and colleges and universities, then went on to persuade the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And then that Brown decision in 1954 gave impetus and inspiration to a civil rights movement of activists. They engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to blacks and to whites, it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. With that understanding, it succeeded at great personal cost and with great disruption, but ending segregation and public accommodations and interstate transportation and local transportation, swimming pools, water fountains, employment. And then in 1968, it succeeded in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination in passing a fair housing law that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale of rental of housing. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended. Left untouched, the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. Clearly defined areas that were all white, or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black or mostly black. I've lived in many of them. Everyone that I lived in was segregated in this way. How could it be? If we came to understand that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, how could it be we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly it's because it's hard to redress residential segregation. If we abolish segregation on buses, next day you sit anywhere you want on a bus. Abolish segregation in restaurants, the next day you go to any restaurant. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, easterners, westerners, is adopted a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to continue the civil rights struggle and ending residential segregation. And the excuse goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the kinds of segregation that we abolished in the 20th century, if it was required by the federal government, that was a Fifth Amendment violation, civil rights violation. We're obligated as Americans to do something about civil rights violations. If it was done by state or local governments, that was a 14th Amendment violation, also something that we're obligated to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That's not something that was done by government, not by law, by regulation, by public policy, by ordinance. That just sort of happened. It happened because, private homeowners or landlords refused to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because of private businesses, not government agencies, but actors in the private economy like banks or real estate agents discriminate in how they carried out their private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and so many can't afford to move to more highly resourced white neighborhoods. All of these bigoted but individual, private sector, self-choice, economic factors, it's what's created residential segregation, and we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We give a name to this rationalization. It's one we all use. We say what we've got is de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law, not in regulation, not in public policy. Well, I want to thank Kim for not going on and on about my previous work, but I did spend much of my time writing about education policy. That was my area of expertise. I didn't know much about housing until I began the research that led to this book, The Color of Law. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I spent much of my time criticizing the dominant education policy theory of this country. That theory was that we had an achievement gap in schools. We do, between Black and white children. On average, Black children achieve at lower levels than white children. Latino children achieve at lower levels than white children on average, so the low-income children. And we told ourselves that the reason that there's this achievement gap is because teachers are bigoted. They have low expectations of Black children and other disadvantaged children. And if somehow we can only raise the expectations of teachers, force them to try harder, the achievement gap will disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory. It made no sense to me whatsoever. Of course, there are some teachers who are bigoted, but that's not the main reason we have an achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many low-income, disadvantaged, disproportionately African-American children come to school with serious social and economic disadvantages that inhibit their ability to learn. So I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, African-American children in low-income neighborhoods in this country can have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children, 4 times the rate. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And I explained in this column that if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child without. It's not true of every child, but more likely to be up at night wheezing and coming to school drowsy the next day, sleepless. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma, that group is going to have somewhat lower average achievement. No matter how high we make teachers' expectations, no matter how often we test children and hold teachers accountable for the test scores. A sleepy group is going to be lower achieving on average than a non-sleepy group. Well, asthma makes a small difference in creating the achievement gap, but then you begin to think of all the other social and economic conditions that inhibit learning. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity. When you consider all of these and many other social and economic disadvantages, you've explained the achievement gap. It's not that some teachers aren't bigoted, but that's not the main reason why we have an achievement gap. Well, this is what I was thinking about some 15 years ago. And I began to realize that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity that affects that child's achievement. What happens when you have a school which concentrates children, where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or some other challenge like that? How can such a school ever expect to have the same level of achievement as a school where children come to school well-rested, in good health, well-nourished, from economically secure homes? Of course, you can pass a law, as we did in 2001, the No Child Left Behind law, saying that if we only test children enough and hold teachers accountable for it, we'll eliminate the achievement gap. But that's not going to do the trick if we're not addressing those other social and economic conditions. Well, we call those schools where we concentrate children with these serious social and economic disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country. And they're more segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think of neighborhood segregation as an educational problem. I still really hadn't realized the extent of state-sponsored segregation that led to my book, but I was thinking of it as an educational problem. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated 2 school districts. Seattle, Washington was one, Louisville, Kentucky was the other, that implemented a very token school desegregation plan. Both of them gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice of the parent would further intensify segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of parents whose choice wouldn't do that. So If you had an all-white or mostly white school and you had one place left in that school and both a black and a white child applied for that last remaining place, the black child would be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. It's a trivial program. You don't have one place left very often, and both a black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court examined this program, denounced it. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts, who said you couldn't do such a thing. He explained that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. He was right about that. He said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that as well. But he said the neighborhoods are segregated de facto for all the reasons I described before in the private economy and private bigotry and self-choice and economic differences, income differences. And the Chief Justice said, if you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government, it's prohibited for government to do anything explicitly to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that happened some years before in one of those two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in downtown Louisville. That African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to bring up his family in a single-family home. Nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this single-family home, all-white suburb of Shively, bought a second home in his neighborhood and resold it to the African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to interfere there as well. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the entire criminal justice system, the courts, the prosecutors are all mobilized to enforce the racial boundaries of Louisville, it's a 14th Amendment violation. And then I looked into it further and I found, and I'm not exaggerating here, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases nationwide, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, New York, Baltimore, hundreds and hundreds of cases of police protected, sometimes even police organized, police led violence, mob violence, designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police, agents of the state, were involved in either fomenting, protecting, or leading this kind of violence, was a 14th Amendment violation. Every one of them creates an obligation for us as American citizens to remedy, and we've never accepted that obligation. Well, I began to look into it further, and I found that it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created the segregation we know today, but that there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, all of which were explicitly designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. Every one of them was unconstitutional. I came to the conclusion, after examining all of these many policies, that de facto segregation was an utter myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. We have a constitutional obligation to remedy residential segregation, and as I say, we've never accepted that obligation. Well, let me describe in the few minutes I have with you this afternoon or this morning, some of the main policies that the federal government followed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another. Perhaps the most prominent of them, the most powerful perhaps, was a policy of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, intensifying in the post-World War II period, designed to move the entire white working class population, lower middle class population, out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs that would be prohibited for African American residents. This was a racially explicit policy on the part of the federal government. It was successful. It created a white noose of all white suburban neighborhoods around every metropolitan area of this country, around every downtown area of this country where African Americans in particular were living. You're familiar with all of these suburbs. They exist in Portland and everywhere else. The most famous of them on the East Coast is Levittown, east of New York City. Perhaps you've heard of that. Ezra, I know you're from Los Angeles. Places like Lakewood, Westchester, in the San Fernando Valley, Panorama City. All of these were federally created, all white suburbs in the post-World War II period, and in every metropolitan area in between, there was similar suburbs created. Taking the example of Levittown, the best known of these, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. The builder, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land and build 17,000 homes for which he yet had no buyers. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do that. We were in a suburban country at that time. No bank thought that people would be crazy enough to buy these homes out in the suburbs. But the only way that Levitt could assemble the capital to buy the land, build the houses, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, excuse me, submitting his plans for the development to the FHA and VA that included the architectural design of the homes, the materials he was going to use in construction, the layout of the streets, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. It did this throughout the country. These deeds are still in existence today. If you look at the deeds in any of the homes that were created at this time with Federal Housing Administration or Veterans Administration support, you'll see that the exclusionary language is still there. The homes are for Caucasians only, unless, of course, you had a domestic servant living with you. That was an exception. Well, this was not the action of rogue bureaucrats, this requirement. It was an explicit, racially explicit, written federal policy. The Federal Housing Administration distributed a manual to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders for federal bank guarantees for their developments. The manual said explicitly you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a proposal from a developer that would include selling homes to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to build an all-white community that was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense, has no basis in reality. Of course, Levitt was a bigot. If left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold to African Americans. But does that make this private activity? No. He had federal bank guarantees for his development. If the federal government had followed its constitutional obligations and told Levitt and any of these other builders, we'll guarantee your bank loans, provided you sell the homes on a non-discriminatory basis, bigoted or not, Levitt would have had to do so. This is state-sponsored, state-required segregation. Well, those homes in suburbs like this all over the country were inexpensive in the post-World War II period. They cost about $8,000, $9,000, at the most $10,000 around 1950. In today's money, that's about $100,000 in today's currency. White, working class, returning war veterans were able to buy those homes easily with jobs in the post-war economy. African Americans were also equally able to buy those homes if they had jobs in the post-war boom, and they did. But they were prohibited from doing so, not by economics, but by explicit racial policy. Well, as you all know, those homes no longer sell for $100,000 today. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and in some places, particularly on the West Coast, they may sell for $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes with federal bank guarantees, with federal requirements that it be in an all-white neighborhood, gained over the next couple of generations wealth as their homes gained in equity. Most American families who have any wealth get it from the appreciation and the value of their homes and the equity they have in their homes. The white families use that equity to send their children to college. They use it to take care of temporary emergencies, perhaps temporary unemployment or a medical emergency. If you have wealth, you can weather temporary unemployment, the loss of a job. You can draw on your wealth to sustain you. If you don't have wealth and you lose a job, you're pushed further down the economic scale in a permanent fashion. White families also use that accumulated wealth from the equity they had in their homes to subsidize their retirements and to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes. You'd think that people with similar incomes would have similar wealth. They could have similar savings. People with the same incomes can save the same amount. But in reality, although white households have about 60% of the income of blacks, black wealth is only about, blacks have 60% of the income of white households. But when it comes to wealth, black wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century that's never been remedied and that we've never accepted the responsibility to remedy. Well, let me mention one other program just briefly, federal program. That's public housing, something we all misunderstand as well. We think public housing is a place where poor people live, lots of young mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. The first civilian public housing in this country was built during the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal during the Depression. We had a 25% unemployment rate in this country at the time. The unemployed were not permitted. Housing was for families whose households heads had jobs, good jobs, stable jobs, could afford to pay the full cost of the housing in their rent. Housing wasn't subsidized. We were building public housing because there was a housing shortage and because we needed construction jobs for construction workers, not as a way of subsidizing rental for working class families. But everywhere the Public Works Administration built this housing, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites and separate projects for blacks, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed in neighborhoods that were integrated. That may surprise you as well. But in the 20th century, early 20th century, we had much more downtown integration than we have today. You'd be stunned if you could be transported back to the mid-early 20th century to see the extent of residential segregation that existed, residential integration that existed at that time. It existed for the simple reason that we were a manufacturing economy, and most jobs and factories had to be located near a deep water port or a railroad terminal. So workers, both black and white, could walk to work or take short streetcar rides. They didn't have automobiles and they weren't living in the suburbs. Everywhere the federal government built this public housing, it segregated it, even in previously integrated neighborhoods. The very first public housing project in this country was built in Atlanta, outside Atlanta, in a neighborhood called the Flats, an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration demolished housing there and built a project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who had been living in that community as well to double, triple up with relatives, find less adequate housing elsewhere. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to describe self-satisfied smug places. They think, to some extent, like Portland, that they're better, more progressive than everywhere else. One of them I describe as Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maybe you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing in that integrated neighborhood to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation there and elsewhere with similar projects in the Boston area that exist to this day. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes described in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. Says his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl. It's what you'd expect to see in an integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation there and with other projects in Cleveland that persists to this day. On the West Coast, this pattern and effort of the federal government to create segregation intensified. The federal government built war plants during the war, during World War II, building ships and airplanes and tanks and jeeps, and hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to cities to take jobs in these war plants. There was very little African-American population on the West Coast prior to World War II. It was the migration of workers to take jobs in World War II industries that brought African-Americans in substantial numbers for the first time here. And everywhere, the government had to find housing for these workers if it wanted the tanks and the ships and the aircraft carriers and the planes to be built. And it did. It built housing for war workers, everywhere segregating them, even though they were working in the same war plants. Separate projects for whites, separate projects for blacks, creating segregation where it hadn't even had a sniff of existence prior to that time. In San Francisco, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers. 4 were for whites only, 1 for African Americans in a neighborhood you may have heard of, the Fillmore district, that then became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. In Los Angeles, Watts became the black neighborhood of Los Angeles because that's where the government placed housing for war workers. And in Portland and Seattle, up and down the West Coast, the same policy was practiced, creating segregation where it hadn't previously been known. There were state policies as well that created segregation. Real estate agents had to subscribe in the 20th century to a code of ethics that prohibited their selling a home to a black family in a white neighborhood. Every one of those real estate agents was licensed by a state licensing agency. Every time a state licensing agency licensed a realtor or a real estate agent who subscribed to that National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics, the state licensing agency was committing a 14th Amendment violation, a civil rights violation that we are obligated to remedy. The IRS at the federal level gave tax exemptions to institutions, nonprofit institutions, that made part of their mission to preserve the racial segregation, the all-white segregation of the communities where they existed. In my book, The Color of Law, I describe how the University of Chicago had a team of lawyers whose job it was to sue to have African Americans evicted from homes in the neighborhood surrounding the University of Chicago. Every tax exemption that the IRS gave the University of Chicago during the 10 to 15 years where it had this department was a civil rights violation that we have an obligation to remedy. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. You know, I know, policymakers, housing experts know what to do about residential segregation. I can give you a couple of examples. We need an affirmative action program in housing that is completely constitutionally justified by this history that I've described in these all-white suburbs that were created in the mid-20th century that now are unaffordable to working class families of either race. The federal government should be buying up homes at market rates and reselling them to qualified African Americans in particular at deeply discounted prices because they were once affordable to African Americans and are now no longer. At the low end, we have policies that reinforce segregation for low-income families. The biggest program we have is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a program of the Treasury Department that gives tax credits to states, which then redistribute them to nonprofit developers. the Treasury Department regulations for the low-income housing tax credit program place a premium on placing low-income housing tax credit units in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's crazy. It's not that we shouldn't be building better housing in those neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But to place a priority on reinforcing segregation rather than having a priority to build that housing in higher opportunity places, this is a program easily modified. Some of the programs to redress segregation will be expensive, like the affirmative action program that I talked about, where the federal government should be selling homes at deeply discounted prices to African Americans and previously exclusive communities. Some of them would be virtually no cost at all, such as changing the priorities of the low-income housing tax credit program and requiring communities to accept such projects, even if their zoning ordinances would otherwise prohibit them. Well, as I say, the policies to redress segregation are well known. What's missing is a new civil rights movement in this country that will engage in the kind of activism that the civil rights movement engaged in the 1960s to redress the forms of segregation that we eliminated in those days. That new civil rights movement will have to engage in new kinds of tactics as well as old ones in order to make it uncomfortable for this country to maintain the segregated patterns that we've created. The segregation that we've created, that wealth gap that we've created as a result of unconstitutional policies creates the most serious social problems that we have in this country today. I've already described the achievement gap in schools. That's the result of the concentration of low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods. It also creates health disparities between Blacks and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because so many are concentrated in neighborhoods with more pollution, more diesel trucks driving through, less access to grocery stores that sell fresh food. It predicts not only mass incarceration of young African American men, but the police abuse that we spent so much time demonstrating against in the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations. I'm not suggesting that no police would ever discriminate against African Americans if it weren't for segregation. But when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without good jobs, without access to good jobs, without access to schools that have high achieving students, it's inevitable that the police will assume the stance of an occupying force and behave accordingly in the same way that occupying forces in other colonial situations, India, the Congo, have behaved. And finally, let me say that the segregation that we have created, and therefore that we are responsible for uncreating, has a result that's very, very dangerous and frightening to me, and I think to you as well, and that is the extreme political polarization that we have in this country today. It largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to create the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and so many whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other, to empathize with each other, to have a conception of what each other's life experiences are? That's a consequence of the unconstitutional residential segregation that we've created. I am working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create a new national committee to redress segregation in housing, whose job it will be to organize local committees to make it uncomfortable to maintain patterns of segregation. We were about to launch this national committee before the social distancing, the pandemic came upon us. We're going to relaunch it soon. And if any of you are interested in being on the mailing list for the launch of that committee, I'd be glad to put you on that. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad to engage in a discussion or questions, however you'd like to proceed. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Richard. It is always a pleasure to hear you speak, and such an eye-opening experience. A number of folks in the chat have asked how they can learn more about so many of the subjects you've talked about. I want to highlight that Richard's book, The Color of Law, is available from all fine booksellers across the country. And I'll say that as an attorney, I found it particularly pernicious to read about the contracts and the covenants that were put in place to weaponize the legal system to aid this discrimination and segregation. We do have time for some Q&A, and so I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Johnson to ask the first question. Nicole?
Thank you, Ezra. And thank you for your presentation, Richard. It was amazing. And you answered one of the questions I had. And so I wanted to dive a little deeper. So at the end of your presentation, you said that we know the policies. There's no mystery to what happened and what is continuing to happen. And my question is, if as advocates, as home builders, as policymakers, if we know the wrong that's been done, and we know how to correct it, as the suggestions you've said, why do you think it hasn't been corrected, or why is there hesitation around correcting those wrongs?
Well, if you'll forgive me, Nicole, I think you answered the question in the way you phrased it. You talked about advocates. You talked about home builders. You talked about policymakers. You didn't talk about citizens. And that's where the solution lies. The solution lies with I'm repeating myself now, a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable not to implement these policies that we all know about. It's not going to happen simply because we have good ideas. We've had these good ideas. It's going to happen because we engage in the kinds of direct action and mobilization that's necessary to change these policies. It can be done. We've done it before. The civil rights movement died at the end of the 1960s. It can be revived, and it can begin to address this most serious of all the forms of segregation that we have, because everything else relies on residential segregation. We wouldn't have segregated schools if it wasn't for residential segregation or any of the other problems that we have. I mentioned that I am hopeful that a new civil rights committee will be formed. Ezra, I don't know if it's appropriate to ask people to let you know if they want to be on the mailing list, and you can then send me a list of people who do, but we are going to launch it soon. I will say also, and maybe I can put this in the chat, or maybe I can just send it to you and you can send it out. You can send a follow-up email to people. All right, I wrote a column in the New York Times just a couple of months ago in which I picked on one community. It could be any community in this country. I picked on San Mateo, California, where a community, an all-white community, was created in the 1940s. Homes sold then for about $5,000 a piece, $100,000 in today's money, and now selling for $1 million and more. You can identify in this column the real estate agency, the bank, the developer that cooperated with the federal government in creating this segregation. Those three institutions, the real estate agency, the bank, the developer, all exist today still, or their successors exist today. And one of the things I said in this article is that when a successor company absorbs a predecessor, it absorbs not only the financial assets and liabilities, but the moral liabilities as well. Well, each of those institutions should be creating a down payment assistance fund of substantial amounts to enable African Americans to move to communities which they cannot afford to today, both because the values of the homes are appreciated and because they've been denied the wealth that gives them the down payment they would need even if they could afford homes in these communities. Well, that's the kind of target for a direct action campaign that the local civil rights committee should have, is to get those institutions to create those kinds of down payment assistance funds. And that can be done in any community. I just, as I say, I used one as an example, but you can do the same thing in any community. You can trace which private institutions cooperated with the federal government to create this segregation.
Thank you, Richard. David?
Hi, thank you so much for your comments, Richard. It is always inspiring to hear you speak. I am really tempted to do something that probably annoys historians everywhere, which is to ask you a little bit about the future, and I can't help it because I feel like your perspective is so valuable. There's currently a shortage of affordable housing options for low-income families in the Portland metro region, which continues to grow as thousands of families relocate here each year. Since you've studied housing issues and development in places like Seattle and San Francisco, in your opinion, without any changes in affordable housing investments, our laws and policy, what does a city like Portland look like in 10 or 20 years?
Well, I know that historians may be offended when you ask about the future, but I'm not offended because I'm not a historian. Not a professional one anyway. They told you I'm an education policy expert. I came to this by way of education. But let me, can I take one exception to one thing that you said, and that is, this is something that we do everywhere, and I think it's very dangerous. We talk about affordable housing as though the only people who can't afford housing today are low-income families. But, you know, middle-income, working-class, particularly African Americans who are also segregated, can't afford the housing either. And we have no programs that address that problem. The programs we have for low-income families are inadequate. As you know, the Section 8 voucher program, for example, is not an entitlement. Only 1/4 of the eligible families can get a voucher. The waiting lists are closed in most places. Quite different from the way we handle subsidized housing for middle-class families. If you own a home and typically more disproportionately a white homeowner in a suburb owns a home, that homeowner automatically gets a mortgage interest deduction. It's an entitlement. You don't have to get online and say, well, I hope I get a mortgage interest deduction because I know that only 1/4 of the homeowners who are eligible for it can get it. But when we deal with low-income families, we don't, it's not an entitlement. We just appropriate a certain amount of money, as I say, about 1/4 of the amount that's needed for all the eligible families. And if you're not in the first 1/4 of the families that lines up, you're out of luck. Well, this is, and this is going to, of course, as you know, be much exacerbated as a result of the pandemic and the loss of income that's disproportionately experienced by low-income African-American and Hispanic families in particular, by the evictions and the people who have to start all over in homes afterwards. So what's the future going to look like? It's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a disaster. I mentioned before that the achievement gap in schools is going to be much exacerbated because of the pandemic, because children from more poorly educated parents are going to be much less able to do distance learning than children with highly educated parents. It's as though some children went to school with teachers who were high school graduates and other children went to school with teachers who were college graduates. Would we expect those schools to achieve the same amount? Obviously not. But that's what we're doing with the pandemic. And we may have no choice, but we need to somehow figure out how to compensate for that. And nobody is talking about the kinds of resources that are necessary to compensate for that particular effect of the pandemic. So I guess I don't know the future, and I guess maybe you do. I don't, but unless we do something very differently, and we're going to be in much worse situation in the future than we are now.
Richard, I'd like to know if there are any communities across the country who have been implementing policies that you see as moving the ball appropriately in the other direction.
Oh, yes, there are many communities that are taking small steps because that's all communities can take on their own. Not only because there's not federal support, but because there's no political support for doing something really significant. But there are many communities that are taking small steps that are models for what much bigger steps could be. There are some communities, for example, that have programs that subsidize the Section 8 vouchers of families who choose to move to more highly resourced neighborhoods and provide counseling for them and advice and help in finding apartments, which are very rare in communities with exclusionary zoning provisions. So those kinds of mobility programs exist in maybe a dozen communities around the country. There are inclusionary zoning rules, which, and this gets back to David's question, that require in larger size developments a share of homes set aside for low-income families. And then we have, as a result, and that's a step in the right direction, but I say that's a step we have in the result, a hollowed out middle in those developments where we have market rate affluent families and low-income families, and not the missing middle in between. And there are very, very few communities, but some, that are subsidizing housing for people that the federal government does not subsidize, and that is for working class, workforce housing, it's called, missing middle housing. There are some communities that are doing that. There are some communities that are doing a better job of placing low-income housing tax credit developments in higher opportunity communities. Although the Treasury Department has this absurd priority, states are not required to follow it. And so it's possible for states in their what's called their qualified allocation plans to place a different priority. And so some communities are doing that. Some communities are preventing displacement and gentrification to some extent by with rent control, with rigorous rent control, with limits on condominium conversions. So there are many, many programs around the country that are small steps, but we don't have a national movement to redress segregation that we need to take big steps.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Ezra. Let me see here. Okay, I'm gonna take this question a little differently. So over the past few decades, we've seen local governments adopt new methods that can appear neutral to keep more diverse and affordable housing options out of exclusive residential areas, such as standard designs, height limits, and historic designations, which has happened in Portland. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that so long as we refuse to recognize the history of unconstitutional segregation and the obligation it requires for race-specific remedies to undo that unconstitutional segregation, many race-neutral policies, more than you even mentioned, will reinforce segregation. The most obvious one, and I know you're talking about this, you've talked about this a lot in Portland and taken some steps, are zoning laws that are race neutral, that require, prohibit the construction of anything but single family homes in many communities. But there are many others. I've written about one that's quite common in reinforcing segregation, and that's the disparate effect of property tax assessment policies that wind up taxing African Americans excessively for public services, because African American homes are typically assessed at values that are much closer to their market values than white homes are, or homes in white neighborhoods, for two reasons, or for several reasons. One is white homeowners are much more successful in challenging their assessments and appealing their assessments. And so they get assessments that are lower than they should be based on their market value. Another reason is that white neighborhoods tend to appreciate in value at a faster rate than Black neighborhoods. So anytime there's a gap in time between one assessment and the next assessment, white homes are going to be farther distant from their market rates than Black homes are. And so African American tax rates are going to be higher relative to the value of their homes than white tax rates are. That's a completely race-neutral policy, whether you assess homes every 2 years or every 3 years or however often a local community does it. It's not racially specific, but it has a disastrous effect on low-income minority neighborhoods. So there are many, many race-neutral policies. Exclusionary zoning is probably the most talked about. But let me just say about exclusionary zoning. Abolishing exclusionary zoning is a necessary first step. But without the kinds of affirmative action programs that I talked about, it will not redress segregation. Because if you abolish single-family zoning, more often than not, the people who are going to gobble up those townhouses and condominiums are not going to be segregated minority families, but young professionals who can't either afford to live in those communities without some kind of abolition of low density housing.
David, I think I'll turn it over to you for our last question.
Well, thank you, Ezra. It's really hard to come up with one last question here. There's so many things I would love to ask you, Richard, but I guess I'll leave it with your research has illustrated the connection between racist policies restricting access to affordable homes, such as redlining, zoning ordinances, FHA loans, restrictive covenants, and the ability of white families to accumulate intergenerational wealth through homeownership, where Black families were intentionally denied access to the supports that made this possible. Is homeownership still the most relevant method for wealth generation for families?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. My answer, briefly, is no. It was home ownership that created, to a substantial extent, this wealth gap that we have. But you only gain wealth if you happen to own a home in a neighborhood that's about to appreciate in value faster than other neighborhoods. And most African Americans, for example, who own their homes have not gained the kind of wealth that whites have, because when they've owned their homes, they typically own them in segregated neighborhoods where property values haven't appreciated. In my judgment, the best way to close the wealth gap is with income policies that give people the right to incomes that are large enough that they can save from them, without having to gamble that the place that they own a home is going to be in an appreciating neighborhood. Home ownership may be desirable for personal reasons for a lot of people. They may prefer to own their homes than rent them. But there's no guarantee that if you own a home, you're going to gain wealth from that. We should have income policies. For example, we should have a minimum wage that's much, much higher than the $15 we're talking about now, so that people can earn a truly living wage from the kinds of jobs that are available and can save and build wealth in that way. We should reform our union organizing laws so that it's again possible for workers in the kind of economy we have today to organize unions and increase their incomes in that way, so that they can also save and so that they can get the kind of health insurance guarantees that doesn't deprive them of whatever savings they have in the case of a medical emergency. So those are the kinds of policies that I would prioritize if the goal was to enable people to save and gain wealth. I'm certainly not objecting to home ownership. There are lots of good reasons to own homes, but if the reason you're owning a home is because you think you're going to gain wealth from it, that is not a good reason to own a home. You've got to be, if you could judge which neighborhood was going to appreciate in value before it did and gobble up all the homes in that neighborhood, you'd be a very rich person. But that's like playing the stock market, and it hasn't worked for minorities in the past.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Again, it has been such a treat having you join us today, even remotely. I can see this is perfect timing because your internet seems to be getting a bit fuzzy, but we heard you loud and clear. I just want to remind everybody again to go out there, get yourself a copy of The Color Law, get one for your loved ones too. Get them for people you don't even like that much. It just makes a fantastic gift for everyone. We recommended it last year as our housing stocking stuffer, and I anticipate us recommending it again this year. I want to give a very special thanks to Nicole Johnson and Thousand Friends of Oregon for joining us today and their continued partnership. I want to give special thanks to David and Latino Network for their participation as well. This is a topic that I think is of critical importance to us here in Oregon and throughout the country. And it really is incumbent upon everybody who cares about housing and works in and around housing to learn about this discriminatory past and to advocate for and advance policies that will help rectify it. Doing so will help us build a more just economy, a more just world, and a more just country that I know we all want to see. Thank you again to Northwest Natural for sponsoring today's event. We will be sending out a recording of this meeting to the 200 plus registrants, as well as information about how you can sign up for Richard's newsletter and the continued information on the work that he is doing on fair housing at the national level. So thank you, Richard. Thank you, Thousand Friends of Oregon. Thank you, Latino Network. And thank you, Northwest Natural. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And get out there and enjoy some of this beautiful Portland sun.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.